Hello, and welcome back to today's American Flyer Trains for the fifth video in a series called Common Hidden Problems. Common because they're not unusual, hidden because they can be a challenge to identify the root cause or even the direction to focus down on the cause, and problems that impact the performance, response, or longevity of A.C. Gilbert American Flyer trains. In the video, we're going to be referring to and working on a 499 New Haven EP-5 from 1956 and 1957. It has, as you can see, the all familiar McGinnis paint scheme. Shiny black is the base, and if you collect these, you know what I mean about being shiny or dull. 2 pantographs, and according to David Doyle, it's a tack 2. Now, during the video, we're going to be making reference to material that's provided by David Doyle's Standard Catalog of American Flyer Trains from 2007, as well as Thomas Barker's Gilbert American Flyer S-Gauge Repair and Operating Guide, the 4th edition. What we're going to be looking at has nothing to do specifically with the EP-5. It just so happens that it's the latest one to occur on, and I had it disassembled. Therefore, the timing was perfect to go ahead and switch to this particular common hidden problem that I had in my punch list to make a video concerning. Now, there is a comparable or almost equivalent issue in steam locomotives. What we're going to look at today is unique to diesels, but we'll skip that portion for steam locomotives and focus on that later. You might find the issue we're going to talk about on an EP-5, an Alco, or a GP7, anything that has this particular motor configuration, it might also have the same issue. Let's continue to look at what we're working with first. On this EP-5 single motor diesel, and keep in mind this could also occur on an Alco or a GP7, anything that has this particular motor configuration, we're going to be working around the field and the brush bracket assembly and the motor mount or motor bracket. And that also includes the field clamp, the armature, which is here, and there's 2 subcomponents to the armature I want to point out, and that's the drum style commutator right here, and then these bearings right here in which the armature rotates. The gear covers are in the background. There's 2 of those. The bearing straps are these small brass items right here. The field clamp, and then of course the chassis with pull-more wheels. The issue that we're going to discuss had nothing to do with the performance of this locomotive. It had good forward speed, it was gradual, it had good reverse speed. It too was gradual. The reverse unit was responding very well, as was the entire train. The reverse unit was snapping through its 4 positions extremely well. But what identified the problem for me, or what allowed me to first notice it, was smell. It smelled as though the train were burning oil, that some sort of oil or lubricant was getting overheated. Now, there was no smoke, but it had that very distinctive odor that none of my other diesels have, not a GP7 or an Alco. Then, after about a 10 to 15 minute standard operating session, nothing unusual, I noticed when I picked the unit up, the front was extremely hot on even the body, or warm. Then I turned it over and touched the bottom of the motor along the centered iron side frame assembly, and noticed that it was actually too hot to touch. You couldn't keep your finger there. It was just that generating that much heat, which was very unusual. The first thing I did was disassemble it partially, and seeking then to look for a lack of lubricant, but I really couldn't find any. Everything seemed to have some lubrication, although I'm going to re-lubricate this to my standards, but that didn't appear to be the issue. Then, also related to lubricant, I felt like it had to be friction related, that too much friction was being generated. And I thought about the axles inside the chassis, the axle bushings. I thought about the bearing strap, the bearings and the bearing straps. Were they being held on too tight? Was it squeezing? I thought about the gears as well. Were they meshing properly, or was there too much pressure on the gears? Were they pushing up too hard, the worm gear pushing up too hard against the axle gear? None of that just described appeared to be the root cause. But then I decided to go back and look at the tiny plates at each end of the chassis that act as a stopper to keep the armature from wearing a hole in the casing. Most of the time they're known as thrust plates. Now the purpose served by these is somewhat similar to the thrust washers, although not totally, but somewhat similar to the thrust washers in a steam locomotive. So I began looking for these and looking for ones that were mature and had a hole worn in them, which means that the end of the armature might have access to the chassis itself. When the motor's engaged, the armature is going to thrust against one end or the other. So let's remount the armature, making sure that the bushings are in the correct location. And you'll notice that when it moves forward or reverse, you can see the armature shift or thrust. And what you don't want is the end of this armature thrusting against this softer metal. I mean, with the RPMs this generates, that in itself is going to generate heat if it's rubbing up against that metal. And it, of course, depends on direction. But these little plates, like I'm pointing to here, take the brunt of that pressure. Mr. Barker describes them as being made out of metal. I've only identified them as being made out of plastic. But over years and hours of operation, this plastic can actually wear out, and there can even be a hole worn in it, which allows the end of the armature to reach, again, the chassis. If, in fact, it has worn a dimple in the piece, in the thrust plate, you can actually remove the thrust plate simply by taking a knife or even an X-Acto knife or just a pocket knife and picking it out and then lifting it up with small needle nose pliers or maybe even tweezers and simply flip it around in the other direction. Now, I did that recently on one of my trains and made an incredible improvement in its performance and response. Well, the dimple, this will only last as long as the dimple doesn't get worn in the other direction, which means that even though you had a new flat surface for a while, it could, in fact, re-wear that piece and put a hole in it. Now, let me show you what I'm talking about. This is the thrust plate from the rear of the motor. In other words, it's the thrust plate that gets the armature applied up against it. It takes the brunt of the thrust when the locomotive is in reverse. Now it has a sizable dimple in it, and my first thought was to turn it over and simply reinsert it, but it was so deep I didn't think that it would last too long. But hopefully you can see the size of that hole, or excuse me, the size of the dimple. This is a thrust plate from the front of the motor. In other words, it takes the thrust when the locomotive is traveling in a forward direction. You can see the armature shift forward when it rolled in a forward direction. This one I found out by holding it up to a light with a white paper background. This one actually had a hole in it. So we're looking at the back side of this thrust plate and then the front side of the thrust plate. Noticing that you can actually see in the hole, which looks to be some melting of the plastic around the opening. Again, when it's held up against a white sheet of paper under adequate light, you can clearly see that there is a hole and that the armature has already penetrated this one. Well, what I'm going to do is replace these with parts that I ordered from Portland Hobby. And I always keep a bag of thrust plates on site in my parts department so that I can make this adjustment whenever necessary. Now again, most recently, all I did was reverse the thrust plates. In other words, I didn't take the one in the back and put it up front and vice versa. I actually took the plate and spun it around and then reinserted it in its slot, letting it wear on the other side. But those were plates that just barely had dimples in them at all, but I think it definitely improved the performance of the locomotive. It cut down a little bit on the thrusting. I think it made the gears mesh more cleanly. with less pressure and probably less heat generating. And of course, I think in this one, it's going to generate less heat, which I suspect is either occurring along this worm gear, or it's actually occurring where the end of the armature had penetrated it and was rubbing up against the metal of the body, of the chassis, which is actually a softer metal. Now, I'm not going to do a post-mortem on this and do a trackside test, railhead test. I will come back and follow up on it if it doesn't work. All I'm going to do is simply do some light lubrication to the motor, reassemble it, and hopefully get this one back to production with no more heat generated, no more smell, and back to have a long lifetime. Thanks again for watching Dave's American Flyer Trains. So long, everyone.